I couldn't help but notice your last novella that was published, I guess this last November, brought together four of my favorite things: faith, Christmas, romance, and the Outer Banks.
Yes.
What was your inspiration? Are you a lover of the Outer Banks? Had you been or traveled and that you chose that as the setting for your story?
Well, what happened there is I turned in. So the first one is set here in Charleston, in South Carolina, where I live. And when my mentor read it, she said, "Oh, I want to hear the sister stories." So I wrote the youngest sister story, got it into the publisher, and she said, "Oh, this is a full-length novel. We don't have time to get that out this year." And I'm like, well, I don't want not to have anything out for a couple years when I finally got started. So I said, okay, well, let me write another Christmas novella, because those are faster to get out. And my sister and her husband had bought a rental house on Hatteras. I went to visit and I saw that, and we also went over to Ocracoke Island, where they had been devastated by Hurricane Dorian. And I wanted to write a romance. The romance is it is a romance, but the story is really about as well the people of Ocracoke Island and what they have even still to endure with the devastation. And then they're so far away from everybody and they're so easy to forget. So that was the inspiration, is, things that happen, things I read about, anything can be inspiration.
That's great. I grew up in North Carolina, and so the Outer Banks was always, every year in school, we learned more and more about the Outer Banks until everybody eventually gets to migrate down there and go from time to time. It seemed that your novellas were part of a series.
The Anaya is the name of the press. They're a small Christian publisher, and the word means message. So that's how and it was purposely from the Hebrew.
That's great. When I saw it, I thought that has such a Hebrew ring to it, and realized it's a character in the Old Testament who aided in the reconstruction of the temple. That's so cool. And I'm so excited about what you have coming out still.
Yes. So since my mentor said, and other people wanted to know the other sister stories from the first novella, this summer is the youngest, that novel that they didn't have time to get out last year. That comes out in July. It's called Sweet Summer, and it's the youngest sister story. And then next year, Why They Call It Falling, is the middle sister story, who was actually almost the villain in the first book. But this is where psychology and my writing overlaps. This is a spoiler for my own book, but the middle sister suffers from clinical depression that's just functioning clinical depression, where she can, do what she needs to do, keep a job, and then she can't do much more. And so that helps explain why she did the things in the first book.
I'll be able to converse a little bit more intelligently on your books, because I will be a reader this summer. In June, we're actually going down to the beach, my family. I'll make sure to finish what you've got by then, and then I'll be all the more anticipating the ones that are to come.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So that publishing house, is that specifically fiction?
I think that's all that they publish. They have different lines within that. Mine is contemporary. They have young adult fantasy, which is really interesting, overlapping with Christianity and with faith, but it can be done if people are not too strict.
Right. Well, C.S. Lewis did it. So
yes.
That's pretty good.
Yes. Yes.
So a question I have is, most writers are not privileged to be full-time, without some other job or something like that. So can you tell us what it's like to balance being a professor and a writer?
It depends on the time of the year. Speaking of summer, in the summer is when I can get the bulk of the writing done. But since I got published, I have been continually writing before that, I would really only write in the summer because it's sort of like, why kill myself when nothing is really happening here? So I'd really write in the summer and not hardly at all during the year. I think one of the valuable things to me is there are people who tell you, if you go to these writer conferences, they'll say you have to write every day. You have to give yourself a word count. You have to meet that. And if you can't do that, then you're going to just feel like, well, give it up. So I just give myself permission. If I only have time to write a paragraph, I wrote. If I only have time to write a page, which has been what's happening the last few weeks after midterms and grading, and then I wrote a page. If I had to skip one day, that's fine. Just as long as I'm moving forward. And when I have more time, I write more. Debbie Maycomer one time years ago told us at a speaking engagement that she came to our local group, that she would write 25 pages in a day. And I was like, okay, I'll do it. And I have done it. But you can't do that.
Mm-mm.
No, you cannot do it. You're not a full-time writer. And even if in the summer, if I do 25 pages a couple days in a row, I'm worn out, really exhausted. So
yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for giving yourself some grace. As I just mentioned, that 540 Club, it's a great concept. It really is. And anybody who doesn't know, supposedly if you write 540 words a day, then you will have written, 100,000 for a half a year. And that's great production. But, last week they sent out the request, what's everybody's tally for the week? And I could say, it was over 2,000 words, but that's so highly unusual, So yeah, I want to absorb what these people have to say. I want to, all their advice and everything else like that, but I got to figure out what in the world works for me,
Right.
I'm sure you're the same.
And there's the other thing is some people I think are also too strict that they have to be in a certain situation, at your desk, this music playing or that music playing. I don't ever subscribe to that. I'm like, write when you can, wherever you can. And if you can't write at that moment, take a walk, come back to it, sit down.
Yeah.
So,
one of the mottos that I've heard is that nothing is wasted, from our experience. So I would imagine, even though you kind of saw yourself in first grade being somehow, a doctor, that there were nonetheless kind of misdirections or missteps or whatever. Have those, actually steps or missteps, have they proven useful in your writing?
I think God uses everything. I'm trying to think of my missteps have been when I didn't write at all, but I honestly think that was, I really, when you have baby and you're teaching at the same time, I don't think I could have found time to write. My misstep in my writing has been when I was writing the fantasy. I don't think some of what I was writing would be something I would have actually been comfortable if it had been published. So, because with my Christian writing, my fiction, the writing that's being published now, the members of my church are my biggest supporters that, the people I know. I mean, they just so wonderful, buying my books, coming to my book signing, just so wonderful. They definitely, I wouldn't have told anybody about my, the writing that I had done when I was writing fantasy. And I've actually, say it out loud now. I had mentioned that in my notes to you, there was a film, and I think I mentioned it earlier actually, that where I was Eloise's mentee, they followed me around a conference when I was pitching. I had an over-hour interview, and I'm proud of what I said in the interview and everything. But the only thing they ended up sharing in that film, that documentary that's been shown in festivals and on the internet, is when Eloise had told me to put more sex in my books. And I'm like, of all the intellectual, intelligent, with things I said, this is the only thing they have in there. So it's under my pen name that I don't use. Mm-hmm. And I was writing Christian fiction at that point, so there couldn't be any. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it worked out. I'm glad. Mm-hmm. I'm glad that I don't have to hide what I'm writing from anybody.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah. Well, my writing is nonfiction, and it tends to be all of my missteps. That's a lot of what my books are about. So that's why I was asking, because I've, just been encouraged by God, I think, to find a way to make sure that those things are all redemptive, and have, something positive to say to other people. I realize also that sometimes we can work out some of these things in our lives through our fictional characters, and these people who have come into our lives, and it has not been necessarily the greatest situation in the world. And we just kind of, it's in a sense almost therapeutic. Someone has said that, our characters become our best friends. But I think they're also kind of our therapists to some extent, So, to me, writing is just a fascinating process, because here you are, as a professor writing, a lot of nonfiction, and then when in your other time you're writing fiction. And is it easy to keep those worlds separate, or do you want to keep those worlds separate?
The only overlap is the fiction being informed by the nonfiction that I can see. Except now that I think about it, I'm teaching writing and psychology right now, and I teach students to write all the time in every class, really. So as I hopefully become a better writer, writing, much of any good writing goes across fiction and nonfiction. I was just teaching, how to proofread your nonfiction, your research paper. And I was talking about don't use LY words, passive voice. I'm like, wait, I just heard this somewhere. And it was at the writing conference.
Yes, so, it is. Yeah.
The two areas, good writing goes across all areas.
Mm-hmm. So. Well, yeah, and actually I just finished an interview with Scott talking about all writing being storytelling. And that you can identify, even in nonfiction, you can identify kind of a story arc, and like in research, I mean, it's all about the reader and trying to convince the reader, of this, thing that I've done, and this is valid, and, it means something, and, you should do this research too, and all these kinds of things. So I think there's a lot of persuasion, in both of those kinds of writing. So yeah, that's probably another place of overlap, I guess.
You mentioned Debbie Maycomer, and I would just have to ask, I've seen all of her Hallmark movies. If someone approached you, would you see some of your work going to the small screen?
Oh, I would absolutely love it. Part of it is Charleston is just a beautiful place, and that would be my first novella. And the only thing that's been on the small screen that I know of from Charleston has been that awful, forgive me, what is it called? It's a high society, but it's the bad part of high society in Charleston. That's the only thing that's out there, other than people know it is a beautiful place. And so I would love that. Yes, for me, but also for the city. And then again, Ocracoke. There was the Netflix series that came out last year called Outer Banks on Netflix, and it went to number 1, but it was actually filmed here in Charleston. So the Outer Banks who need those the people on those islands need financial help so much, they didn't get anything. So I would love to support both of those places. So absolutely, I'd love it.
That would be great. and super exciting. One last thing, I was wondering, do you find yourself maybe leaning into a role, or maybe in the future being more focused in a role of mentorship for other writers who are coming up maybe in that genre, or any writing beyond what you teach in your classes?
I had not thought of it, but I'm always, even now that I've joined the local ACFW, the Charleston chapter, which we'd love people to come. We just started a year ago, having meetings, and I'm the vice president. So it's just who I am. I like to be involved and help. And definitely we have younger writers in that group. And I would love to, once I feel more established, to be a speaker at conferences and so on, because they say that most writers are introverted, and I'm not. I'm fine talking, and I'm fine being in front of a group, and I would love to do that. So,
well, do you have anything that you'd like to share with our listeners that we haven't talked about?
Well, I do want to share, if anyone would like to connect with me. I've since this last year and a half of being published, I have joined almost everything out there. I have a Facebook author page. I have a website. I have a blog. I have a newsletter. So any way that somebody who would enjoy connecting, and I share writing tips. So the mentorship aspect. I am hosting other authors on my blog, and recipes, because that's a whole other side of me. I love to cook and bake and sharing. So anyone, I'd love to connect with anybody.
Well, Christina, it's been lovely to spend some time with you. Thank you very much for visiting with us and sharing your life with us, and also sharing your books with the world. And we just wish the best for you in these coming years, and that you'll just get published more and more and known more and more, and you'll be on every kind of media that's out there, and we'll say, and we knew Christina when. So, all right, and thank you to our listeners, and we hope that you will join us again next time. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.